Hello guys, in this chapter I want to talk about the skeletal system. All of us first think that the bone are dry, supposedly lifeless structures with different sizes and shapes in our body. But the skeleton is much more than a supporting framework for the soft tissues of the body. The skeletal system is composed of dynamic living tissue in contract with all other organ systems, and all the times they rebuild and remodel themselves. I want to begin this chapter with a brief description of a skeletal system and a detailed discussion of bone anatomy as the primary organ of this system. Then I want to talk about the important concept of bone physiology, including cartilage growth, bone formation, bone growth and bone remodeling, the regulation of blood calcium, and the effect of aging on the skeletal system. And at the end, I want to discuss a bone fracture and bone repair for you. Our skeletal system includes the bone of the skeleton, as well as the cartilage, ligament, and other connective tissue which can stabilize or connect the bone. Bone of the skeleton are the primary organ of the skeletal system. They can form the rigid framework of the body, and they perform other functions which I will talk about them later for you. We have two types of bone in our body. One type is called compact bone. The compact bone is a relatively rigid connective tissue that appears white, smooth, and solid. It makes up approximately 80% of our total bone mass. And the other type of bone is called a spongy bone, which we call it cancellous or trabecular bone. It's located internal to the compact bone. It appears porous and makes up of approximately 20% of total body mass. The other part of our skeletal system is the cartilage. The cartilage is a semi-rigid connective tissue that is more flexible than the bone. Mature cartilage is avascular. It means that they don't have any blood vessel. And we have two important types of cartilage which works with our skeletal system. One of them is hyaline cartilage, like the cartilage which can attach our ribs to a sternum, the cartilage which cover the end of some of our bones in the joints within the growth plate and model for the bone formation. And the other type of cartilage is called fibrocartilage. The fibrocartilage is a weight-bearing cartilage that withstands compression. It forms the intervertebral disc, the pubic symphysis, and the cartilage pad which we have in our knee joint, which we call it meniscus. Also, the ligaments which can connect bone to bone and the tendons which can connect muscle to bones are the part of our skeletal system. To show you the distribution of cartilage in the adult and the juvenile skeleton. Look at here. In this picture, you can see two different colors for the cartilages. One color is blue, which represents hyaline cartilage, and you can see that the hyaline cartilage is located, as you see in this picture, between the ribs and the sternum. You can see hyaline cartilage in the joints, and all of our joints contain this type of cartilage. You can see this cartilage in the growth plate of the bones. And the other color which you can see in this picture is purple color, which represent fibrocartilage. The fibrocartilage is located between the vertebrae in the intervertebral disc. You can see it in the meniscus, which we have in the knee, and also we can see it in pubic symphysis. So this is the distribution of hyaline and fibrocartilage in different parts of the adult and juvenile skeleton. I will talk about these cartilages more for you. And now you can answer these two questions. What is the difference between the appearance of compact bone and a spongy bone? And in what three locations of the body you can find fibrocartilage? What are the general functions of the bone? Our bones have different functions. One of them is support and protection. The bone can provide a structural support and serve as a framework for the entire body. Bones also protect many delicate tissue and organs from injury and trauma. The rib cage can shield the heart and lungs. The cranial bone enclose and protect the brain. The vertebrae enclose the spinal cord, and the pelvis cradle urinary and reproductive organs, as well as the terminal end of the gastrointestinal tract. They can levers for movement. Bones serve as attachment site for a skeletal muscle, other soft tissue, and some organs. Muscle attached to the bones of the skeleton contract and exert a pull on the skeleton, which then function as a system of levers. The bones of the skeleton can alter the direction and magnitude of the force generated by the skeletal muscle. Potential movement range from powerful contractions needed for running and jumping to delicate movement required the movement of your finger. And in the finger, you have bone. The other function of the bone is hemopoiesis. Hemopoiesis means blood cell production, and this blood cell production happens in the red bone marrow. The other function of our bone is the storage of mineral and energy. Most of your body's reservation of mineral like calcium and phosphate happen in your bone. Calcium is an essential mineral for such body functions as muscle contraction, blood clotting, and release of neurotransmitter from the nerve cells. So these three processes for the calcium ion, these three functions are very important. And I will talk about it later for you. But here you need to know these three important functions. One of the function of calcium ion in your body is blood clotting. One of the other function for the calcium ion is muscle contraction. And the other function of the calcium ion is release of neurotransmitter from the neuron. So these are the three important functions of the calcium ion, and your bone is a great storage of calcium ion in the body. And also we have a storage of phosphate. The phosphate is a structural component in ATP and other nucleotides, and also the phospholipids, and it's very important for our plasma membrane. When calcium or phosphate is needed in our body, some bone connective tissue is broken down and the mineral are released into the blood. And also our bone can work as energy reservoir in our body. They can reserve adipose tissue, specifically in the yellow bone marrow, and when we need energy, this yellow bone marrow can break down and can release energy. So these are the different functions which we have for our bone. And the bone of our body are classified in four important groups. One group of the bone in our body are called long bone, and here you can see the long bone. The long bones are greater in length than width. These bones have the elongated cylindrical shaft or body. This is the most common bone shape. Long bones are formed in the upper limb, as you see here, in the lower limb, all parts of our upper limb and also lower limb. Long bones vary in size. The small bones in the fingers and toes, which you can see here, are actually the long bone. The other type of bone is called short bone. The short bone have a length nearly equal to their width. Examples of short bones include the carpal bone, or the bones which can make our wrist, and the tarsal bone, which can make our ankle. The patella, or the kneecap, which is located between our thigh and leg, is called short bone, and we have a specific name for the patella as a short bone. We call it sesamoid bone. Because the structure of this bone is a small sesame seed shape, and we call it sesamoid bone. And it's embedded in some ligaments, and I will talk about it later for you. The other bone which we have in our body, the other type of bone, is called flat bone. The flat bone are so named because they have flat, thin surface that may be slightly curved. They provide extensive surface area for muscle attachment and protect underlying soft tissue. The flat bones form the roof of the skull, the scapula, or the shoulder blade, which you can see it here, and also the sternum or the breastbone and our ribs. And the other class of the bones are called irregular bones. They have elaborate, sometimes complex shape and don't fit into any of the categories, like the vertebrae, the hip bone, and the several bones which we have in our skull, like sphenoid, ethmoid, and sutural bone, which you will be familiar with them in the lab. So we have 4 different classes for our bone: long bone, short bone, flat bone, and irregular shape bone. Now I want to talk about the anatomy of the bone, the gross anatomy of the bone. And I want to talk about this gross anatomy in the picture which I have here. If you look at this picture, you can see the anatomy of the bone. And our bone is made up of different regions. The first region, which is the elongated and the most important part of our bone, is here. We call it diaphysis. The diaphysis is elongated cylindrical shaft in our bone. It can provide leverage and weight support. In the diaphysis, we have compact bone around, and in the center, you can see some spicules of spongy bone, which come inward the bone. Inside the diaphysis, you can see a cavity, a hollow cylindrical space. In this space, we can see red bone marrow in the children, and we have yellow bone marrow in adult. As you see in this picture, the bones are, unlike cartilage, are highly vascularized. They have many blood vessels, as you see here. Our bone has 2 ends. One of them is proximal end, and one of them is distal end. These 2 ends of the bone are called epiphyses. They are knobby region at the end of bones. We have proximal epiphyses, the end of the bone closest to the body trunk, and we have distal epiphyses, which is the end farthest from the trunk. In the epiphysis, we have a spongy bone, and this spongy bone is covered with a very thin layer of compact bone. And on top of this compact bone, you can see the articular cartilage. And this cartilage is hyaline cartilage. Here you can see the proximal articular cartilage, and here you have distal articular cartilage. This cartilage can cover the joint surface. This is the thin layer of hyaline, and it can reduce the friction when the bones want to move against each other. It can absorb shock in movable joints. The other part of bone is a part which is located between epiphysis and diaphysis. And this part is here. We call it metaphysis. The other name of metaphysis is growth plate or epiphyseal plate. This is a thin layer of hyaline cartilage, and it can provide for longwise bone growth. In adult, this cartilage changes to the bone, and instead of epiphyseal plate, we can call it epiphyseal line. We can only see a remnant of hyaline cartilage there, which we call it epiphyseal line, and I will show you in the next pictures. So you can see all of these parts in the PowerPoint which I posted for you on your blackboard. We have different regions for our bone. We have diaphysis, which is actually the body or shaft of the bone. We have medullary cavity, which is located inside the diaphysis. We have epiphysis, one of them is proximal and the other one is distal epiphysis, and we have metaphysis, which is a region between epiphysis and diaphysis. And the other name of metaphysis is epiphyseal plate. In children and in adult, we call it epiphyseal line. The bone is covered by a tough sheet of connective tissue. This connective tissue, which covers the bone from outside, is called periosteum. We have two layers for periosteum. The outer layer is fibrous layer. It can protect the bone from surrounding structure. It can anchor blood vessels and nerves to the bone surface, and it's the attachment site for ligaments and tendons. We call it fibrous layer or outer layer. The inner layer is called cellular layer, and you can see cellular layer here. In the cellular layer, we have more cells than fibers. And the cells which can be seen here are the cells which can make our bone, which we call them osteoprogenitor cell. We can see osteoblast or young cell of the bone and osteoclast or macrophage of the bone. I will show you these cells later. It attached to the bone surface with many fibers, collagen fibers, which we call them perforating fibers. And these perforating fibers can attach the periosteum to the surface of the bone. These perforating fibers are very hard. We cannot detach periosteum from the bone easily. Just the heat and high temperature can solve these fibers, and then we can separate them. So the periosteum, as you see here, is the tough sheet which covers the bone from outside. We have outer fibrous layer of dense irregular connective tissue, and we have inner cellular layer. And the cells which you can see in periosteum are osteoprogenitor cells. These are the cells which can make this cells of the bone. They are stem cells actually. We have osteoblast. The osteoblasts are young cells of the bone, and the osteoclasts are the macrophage of the bone. And our can attach to the bone by some perforating fibers. The other layer which you can see in the bone is called endosteum. Here you can see the endosteum. The endosteum cover the internal surface of the bone within the medullary cavity. This is the incomplete layer of the cells. And we have different cell type here. One of them is osteoprogenitor, one of them is osteoblast, and the other one is called osteoclast. So if I want to draw the periosteum and endosteum for you, you can see it like this. Imagine that this is the bone. And here inside the bone, you have a medullary cavity. Then the blue layer, which I draw, sorry, let me draw it again for you. This is the bone. Here you can see the medullary cavity. And now this red layer, which you can see around the bone, is called periosteum. And the yellow layer, which you can see inside the cavity and cover the cavity for you, is called endosteum. And the endosteum is incomplete layer of cells. We have, you can see it in the picture, we have osteoclast, osteoblast, and osteoprogenitor in the endosteum. The other type of bone is the flat bone. The flat bone, like the bones which we have in our skull. And the flat bones have a specific anatomy. We have the same anatomy for our short and irregular bone too. Look at here. In the flat bone, short bone, and irregular bone, we have a spongy bone inside, and this spongy bone is sandwiched by compact bone from both sides. And this compact bone can protect this spongy bone. The spongy bone inside has a specific name, and we call it diploe. And both surface of our bone is covered by periosteum. So you can see periosteum here and here. We don't have any endosteum, and we don't have any medullary cavity in short, flat, and irregular shape bone. Our bones are highly vascularized. And we have blood vessels in the spongy bone, and the blood vessels can enter from the periosteum. We have a foramen on the surface of the bone, which we call it nutrient foramen, and the arteries and veins can pass through this foramen, and I will show you the picture later. And we have nerves which can supply the bone. The nerves can accompany the blood vessels and pass through the nutrient foramen and come to the bone. They can innervate the bone itself, the periosteum, endosteum, and medullary cavity. And most of these nerves are sensory nerve. It means that they bring the information of the bone to our central nervous system. And in this picture, you can see the nutrient foramen. Look at the picture. This is the nutrient foramen, and from this foramen, the blood vessels can go inside, and also the nerves can pass this part. The bone marrow is a soft connective tissue which we have inside the bone. And the bone marrow has two different types. One type is called red bone marrow, and the other one is called yellow bone marrow. The red bone marrow is called myeloid tissue because this tissue is very active for making blood cells. We call it hemopoietic tissue or hematopoietic tissue. In this tissue, we have reticular connective tissue full of reticular fibers. We have immature blood cells, and we have many fat cells or adipocytes. In children, this red bone marrow is located in the spongy bone and the medullary cavity of all of our long bones. But in adults, it's located only in selected area in our axial skeleton, like the skull, the vertebrae, the ribs, sternum, ossicocci or hip bone, and proximal epiphysis of humerus and femur, and I will show you in the next picture. So look at here. In this picture, you can see the location of red bone marrow. The red bone marrow is located in the skull bone, as you see here, the cranial bone. We have it in our ribs, in the vertebrae, in the hip bone, and also proximal extremity of humerus and proximal extremity of the femur. But where is the location of yellow bone marrow? The yellow bone marrow is product of red bone marrow degeneration when the child becomes mature. This is a fatty substance and may convert back to red bone marrow when we need it. When we have severe anemia, when we have blood cancer or bone marrow cancer, the yellow bone marrow has this potential to become red again and making blood cells again. And here in this part, you see that how the yellow bone marrow form in the middle of the bone, and progressively it can occupy all the spaces and change the red bone marrow. And we can do bone marrow transplant. The red bone marrow may be transplanted in the individual whose red bone marrow was destroyed by radiation, chemotherapy, or who has abnormally functioning red bone marrow. And also at the time of leukemia, we have it. The donor red bone marrow is most commonly harvested from the hip bone or less commonly from the sternum. The harvested cells are injected into the blood of the recipient, where they will be transported to the normal location of the red bone marrow. The bone marrow must be matched between the donor and recipient, just as blood type must be matched so the immune system will not attack the tissue as something foreign. Thus, an individual can receive red bone marrow only from a donor that is a close match. And now you can answer these three questions. What two minerals are stored in bone, and what are their function in the body? And what are several examples of flat bone in the body? And how do the diaphysis and epiphysis of a bone differ from each other in their structure? What is the function of nutrient foramen in the bone? And where is red bone marrow found in the adult skeleton? In the next video, I will talk about the microscopic anatomy of the bone and the cells which we have in each bone.